This is the Texas Land Guys podcast, hosted by brothers Tim Dosch and Tom Dosch. With their partners David Marshall and Trip Rich, they have built DMRE, the leading land brokerage in Texas. With decades of experience brokering deals between landowners and real estate developers, they take you inside the deals that move the market.
Welcome to the Texas Land Guys podcast. Sitting here in Dallas,
Tom.
I've got Tim in Houston. Tim, how are you doing this morning?
Doing good. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you back. I know we had to record an episode not too long ago without you because one of our mics went off in Houston. So we're getting that resolved and ready to roll today.
Yeah, it's crazy with these podcasts because you just assume that, you have all this expensive equipment. This is very expensive equipment. I think our mics are considered, the top mics that you can buy, the same one that Joe Rogan uses and a lot of the podcasts our listeners probably listen to. And it's amazing how things, either they break or they're not. There's some little, technical difficulty. Something has to be unplugged and plugged back in. And we fortunately have some great people helping us out, to try and figure these things out. But there's a lot that goes into it for sure.
Well, it's interesting you're hitting that because coming into the office today, I called you just catch up before we started on the podcast, and you were listening to another podcast on Bitcoin and blockchain and kind of all the cryptocurrencies. I think it's more about probably blockchain than anything else, but it's interesting. So much is currently breaking or kind of inefficient in our financial system. And so it was interesting what you were sharing. I haven't listened to that episode yet, but I thought that was really interesting how that could have a pretty big impact even within our business.
Yeah, I think the real point of it, and a lot of people when they think about crypto or, Bitcoin, I think is what people think about when thinking about crypto is probably the main one. But they think about, investing, they think about a very volatile investment, especially some of these other cryptocurrencies that are, going way up or way down or kind of all over the place, these NFTs. And I think for a lot of people, especially as you get older, there's probably less awareness of what this actually is, understanding of it. I think the younger generation is catching on quicker. But really what this podcast was talking about was not what we think of when we think of crypto, but the technology behind crypto, which is called blockchain. And is an extremely disruptive technology that allows transactions to happen instantaneously, allows verification to happen on both sides so that the value that you're getting without having to have a lot of people in the middle to check it and double check it. And they were talking about how so much of our financial system was built before the internet and uses a lot of different intermediaries. If you think about when you try and send a wire, for a bank wire somewhere, a lot of even credit card companies, like the way we do transactions takes these companies or these entities in between us to make sure that everything is done properly and that we can trust it was done correctly so no one's ripped off. Because in the past that did happen. And he kind of goes through the history, even back to the railroads back in the 1800s, how they would have these certificates that they would be selling for the railroad that was a stock, and how people would just make up certificates and weren't real. And it's interesting just to hear about the history of why we are where we are. And a lot of it is trying to solve problems in the past, but how now with new technology, there's a different way to solve those problems. And so when you think about the different, especially real estate transactions, how many people have to be involved and documents have to be involved to protect everyone, every side, a lot of that is going to become less relevant in the future. What I was thinking about is how it's going to replace jobs, especially at banks, maybe title companies. I think even within our business, it's just transactions will be different, and I think will be better for the consumer. Probably be smoother and be faster for them, but it is going to be disruptive. And so I think it was a Tom Bilyeu show, a podcast I was listening to on how cryptocurrencies are changing our current financial system, but just makes you think a lot. And I think it's good. We talked about how it's good for us to be learning and thinking about these things, and not just for understanding that, but trying to think into the future. How's that going to affect our business and our clients' business, a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, into the future?
Well, there's so much like wire fraud when you're talking about wires that if there is a way to roll that out kind of system wide, and it could eliminate that or reduce it. And then all of the inefficiencies that come with that, because now we have to have, so many different steps to confirm wires. And it is, to your point, it's really inefficient because there's all these kind of bad actors out there trying to, cause problems. And so with a technology like this, it could be pretty incredible. And I had a client yesterday ask me, he's trying to leave the country. And so he was asking, his deal closes on Monday and he's trying to fly out that afternoon. So he's like, what percentage of the time does the transaction fund like the same day? And obviously with what you're talking about, it would be instantaneous. And I told him a lot of times it does, but it's probably like at least 30% of the time that it'll like close one day and fund the next day because they don't get the wire cut off. And there's so many papers to sign on both sides. And it's just a long kind of tedious process. And so to your point, if you simplified the process, inevitably the way that people are working at these title companies, it's not that there's not going to be a need for people, but it's going to change because you won't need people doing some of those tasks. They're going to be doing different tasks and you just shouldn't need as many people ultimately. So it is going to have an impact, and it's interesting to think about what that impact could be.
And what'll probably happen is not necessarily like a wholesale shift right away. And a lot of companies won't just say, hey, we're going from the way we did it before to this new way of doing it. It'll probably look more like options. I think a good example is my in-laws still don't trust putting their credit card on a website. So when they're buying airline tickets, they don't book online. They call the airline and book over the phone, which takes like 3 hours. And now what the airlines have done is they'll still let you do that, but they charge you a fee if you call and book over the phone, or you can go book online for free. And when you look at technology and change, a lot of times the older you are, the harder it is to adjust to that change. And so typically you have people that they're not going to go back. They're not going to learn anything new. And so you may have a system where companies start to offer both options, but incentivize people to choose a cheaper option for the company. And the younger people tend to adopt that first. And then over time, the old way just gets phased out. And it might take, a decade or longer. But, at some point you don't need the person answering the phone, booking the airline ticket because people just don't do it that way anymore. And so I think we're just seeing something that, because it's better for the consumer and it saves money for the merchant, it is going to be the way of the future. It's just a question of, what does implementation look like? How does the government regulate it? Because maybe the government doesn't want it to happen super quickly because there's a cost to that for the economy. And so it'll be interesting to see how it rolls out, but it's definitely what's going to be happening in the future.
Well, the whole digital US currency that you were talking about earlier, it would be a big part of that too, just to roll it out more system-wide. That would be important. And we've already been moving away for a long time from like change and cash. But yeah, to your point, I know people that still they're paying for everything in cash.
If you have a digital dollar that you can use without fees, so there's no, right now if you use a credit card, even if we don't see the charge, the merchant's getting charged 2 or 3%, which is, hits them really hard. A lot of these merchants have, pretty tight margins. And so if you have a US dollar, digital dollar that you can use, it's not a cost to anyone, and it benefits the U.S. because we get more people, basically buying our dollars around the world to trade, even people that are using different currencies. So I don't want to get too in the weeds on it, but I think it's super interesting, and I just encourage everyone to be learning right now. There's so much change happening. Find some good podcasts or some good books and just be learning about it, and so you can be up with what the changes that are happening.
Well, it's interesting because as you're talking about it, I think that we obviously have those in our audience that are really familiar with it and probably understand it a whole lot better than we do. And then there's some people that, like you said, are really not trying to understand anything about it or really don't understand anything about it. And it's like almost Greek to them. And it makes me think of what we're going to talk about today, which is we are going to talk about kind of marketing gimmicks and ways that a lot of landowners will talk to their things they're hearing from other brokers or things that maybe they think they need to do to market their property. And in a lot of ways, it's because really understanding and knowing how to sell attractive land is like Greek to them. Like they just don't understand it. There's like so many different moving parts. You could talk about it for hours, and there's so many different unique variables to land. It's not like selling a house. It's not like selling a stock. It's not like selling something at the grocery store. Like it is so different. It is so complicated. You've been doing it for over 20 years. I've been doing it for about, 14 years now. And you think about in that amount of time, there's still issues that we'll run into that we haven't seen before. And this is thousands of transactions. So I think, that concept of some of the things that we see in the market and some of the ways that are being pushed, especially by like some of these bigger, kind of like online platforms that are promising this quick success or promising that they can get your property sold if it just goes out to a really broad audience. And that may work for some things, but for land is just so different that's not really always going to be the best way to approach it.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about the psychology of the seller. I think in this case, what do they want? And what you're speaking to is part of it is just the sophistication and the understanding of the seller about the market. And it makes sense that they would be an expert on the market. It's kind of like you go to the doctor because you're not a doctor. There's a lot that you don't know. And that's okay. That should be expected. And even people that are a lot of times developers or in the business that understand the business in a lot of ways still don't know the nuances of the land business. And there's a lack of sophistication around some of the things that we deal with every single day. But, pretty much everybody is trying to guarantee the best outcome that they can for their property. And typically that's getting the highest price. Sometimes it's getting a quick close, but normally it's getting the best price that they can get. And just said a different way, not missing the best buyer. And we sometimes will jokingly call this like the white knight or the unicorn buyer. People have this perception of there's someone out there that is just going to overpay for the property, that wants it so bad that they're going to pay. There's all these comps that are here and they're going to just pay that next 15 or 20%, and if I can just find that group, I'm going to maximize the value for my property. And I think there's even more stress around this because a lot of times our clients are families that have owned properties for decades, and this might be their largest asset. And so an extra 10 or 15% is a lot of money. And they're really concerned about, avoiding getting 10% less than they could have or 15% less than they could have. Do you feel like you see that a lot, Tom, when you're talking to sellers up in Dallas?
It's a huge misconception with land that just because the market adjusts that suddenly land is worth less. And it's because the landowners themselves often don't have to sell. And it is a lot of times it's the biggest transaction they'll ever have in their life. And David said it on another episode, it could be the biggest transaction in like multiple generations. It could be the most money that they've made as a family. And it could be, $10 million, $20 million, $30 million. And so for them, if they've held it, like a lot of these great land properties have been held for a long time. So why wouldn't you hold it for a little bit longer if you thought that you could get more? And a lot of times the way the buyers of the market see that is, we'll now instead of worth 30, it's worth like 18. I'll just go pay 18 because that's what it's worth. But that's still not what the seller's willing to sell for. So I definitely see that where landowners are, unless they have some reason where they have to sell, they don't tend to be willing to come off their price. And they tend to look for that unique buyer that they've heard about, that's maybe been out in the market, that maybe bought like a friend's property. It could have been like someone that bought a property 15 years ago. It doesn't even have to be in the same market. And then very, very, naturally, if it was 15 years ago, then the property should be worth 4 times as much now. That's just how they're going to think. And so it's those are the, like you said, that's the psychology of a lot of these landowners is land only gets more valuable over time, which it does. Like if you looked at it from like what was land worth 100 years ago? It's worth a whole lot more now. What was it worth 50 years ago? But we've actually seen some land that even 30, 40 years ago now, it's not actually worth as much as it was. Like there's sites I know about here in Dallas. I know there's areas in Houston, the same thing. It's like actually the land was selling for more per square foot 40 years ago than today, which sounds crazy, but that's actually the case.
Especially when you think of inflation. I mean, that's really crazy when you think of that. But yeah, I think another problem for sellers is there's a lot of misinformation in the market. And so like you're saying, they'll hear of a comp, and we've heard all the time, like we'll sell a site for say 85 a foot. And then the whisper in the market will be, it was 140 a foot that it sold for. And it's like, that's not even close to what it sold for. It sold for 80 a foot. And so, but the other brokers will, misquote it, or they won't really know and they'll guess. And then that kind of gets passed around. And so there's all this misinformation out there. And so even sometimes these big high watermark comps or, such and such corporation went and bought this site, sometimes the details around that are not completely accurate because normally there's a lot of confidentiality around those deals. And the actual pricing and the terms of those transactions are really only known to the people who are directly involved. And so you get a lot of speculation from people that are on the periphery, or maybe they're active in the market and they think they know, but they don't really know. And so their sellers are hearing some of that. They're getting different information that may or may not be accurate. And so that's important to remember too.
Yeah. And I think that 10 years ago, when we were, doing a lot together in like the Heights and the Washington corridor area back when I was in Houston, I was thinking about that the other day. Some of those land prices were really high back then that we were closing deals at. Yeah. And you fast forward 10 years and you would expect, well, wouldn't land be trading for more? And you'd have all these comps. We have tons of comps of deals that closed that we traded, and not even 10 years ago, more recent than that. But we were talking the other day that rents in some of those areas right now they're like less than they were back then, which again, inflation, that's not good. Like that doesn't work. Rents should not be less 10 years later on nicer product than they were back then. And so land prices don't always, go up. And I think that that's something that can be really difficult for a seller, because a broker that doesn't necessarily, that they're not really in the business the way that we are, where they're so involved talking to developers and tracking the current day market, they're going to rely on like comps that they can find. And so they may go talk to an appraiser. They may find some of the actual comps, and they may go use some of those comps of deals we sold 10 years ago and go sit down with the owner and be like, here's comps. And those comps mean absolutely nothing. And so that's really hard for that landowner, because if you're the landowner, you're going to want to believe that, well, somebody sold 10 years ago. And so that's what my property's worth. That puts the landowner in a difficult situation.
Well, there's so many factors that affect the land price. In your example of talking about the Heights area, and you're talking about multifamily sites, which these are the highest sales we've seen ever in the Heights. Some of them reaching to the 130 foot range. And the problem is rents are a huge factor that affects that pricing. So if rents are down, like you mentioned, in some areas of Houston and the infill market where they're significantly down, and there's some vacancy, that's going to have an impact. The other thing is when rates go up like they did, so in your example, going back to when you were working in kind of the late 2015 to 2020 range, there's a huge run in the infill market. And we just saw these really, great pricing. Then COVID hit, and it actually accelerated through 21 and into 22. And so you actually had pricing going up consistently in the infill market. Places like the Heights just kept going up and going up. And we were thinking, man, it's going to be $200 a foot pretty soon. I mean, it's like unstoppable. Then rates go up. And at the same time, there appears to be a consumer that is starting to pull back from the infill market. They're looking more in the suburbs. Maybe that's a factor that happened with COVID. And then maybe there's also just some concern where they're not as aggressive, wanting to go pay up to live in these really nice new luxury infill apartment deals. And so all of a sudden, some of these key factors that were supporting land prices at these record numbers have completely gone away. And so, like you're saying, the comp from a couple of years ago is irrelevant. It's like you got $130 a foot. I mean, that doesn't matter. I mean, the whole everything that went into that being a $130 foot site is no longer true. So no one's going to pay that for it anymore. And one thing I was going to add that I think is so key about what you mentioned earlier about land is that the seller does not reset with the market unless they have to sell. And most land sellers don't have to sell. And I was telling David yesterday, it would be so easy as an investor if it was like the stock market and the price just kind of moved with the market. And so like right now, prices would be really low. They'd be at half what they were before. You could just go buy whatever you wanted really cheap. And then, all right, I can just hold on now for a couple of years and make money. What happens is land prices typically just kind of go up and they plateau in a bad market. And then a good market, they keep going up and then they plateau. And then you get a couple deals that will trade lower because people have to sell and they have to monetize at a time that's not a good time to monetize. But unfortunately, you can't just go repeat those purchases across the market because there's not enough sellers to support that.
Yeah, that's right. You can't manufacture low acquisition prices because it's just not the way that the land market works. When you're thinking, Tim, about the idea of the unicorn buyer, I think there's obviously land comps. And it's like land comps being what did something else sell for? I'm also thinking about how landowners a lot of times will compare their property because, it's very rare that a landowner is not very proud of their property. So they'll compare their property to some other property. It's like an incredible property that got developed. So it could be, if you're in Houston, you think your property should be the next city center. And now you look at city center and you don't really realize that city center, it's been an incredible development. Brad Friel's Midway, they did an incredible job. It wasn't always easy. It's not like the leasing activity was, just like caught on initially and was incredible. It's also so unique that where it sits, the timing of the whole thing, the fact they were able to bring these different uses. Or you could compare it up here in DFW, it's Legacy West, which is one of the most successful mixed use developments, kind of like a city center, like in the entire country. And it has, Rolex and all these really high-end Tiffany, all these really high-end Tesla. Everybody's there on the retail side. It's got multi, it's got Liberty Mutual, it's all these office, big corporations, they're all there. Well, again, you look at it and you don't know like the years that went into that development becoming a reality. And again, it's in Plano. It's located at 121 and DNT, like very similar location to City Center in the DFW, like kind of like the center now of DFW, like City Center. But we'll talk to landowners all across DFW and also even cities. And they're like, we want this to be the next Legacy West. And it's like literally in the middle of nowhere, like completely in the middle of nowhere. It's like, a lot of these will never be Legacy West. They don't have the demographics. They don't have the traffic. They don't have the schools. They just don't have, there's so many different things, like the proximity to the major airport, everything that Legacy West has, all the jobs nearby. But also like these landowners that are holding on to that kind of belief, thinking, just because maybe DFW or Houston is this major kind of gateway market now into the US, it doesn't mean that your property is going to get that kind of attention. And so these are the type of conversations that we have to have with these landowners a lot of time to try to be realistic. And their timing to sell, I think, is critical in that. Because like you said, if they're thinking, I want to sell or I have to sell, or it's like, I don't really care if I don't sell for the next 20 years. Those are very different situations as to how we would advise a landowner.
Yeah. And I think it's just dealing with reality today, whatever point in time you're at. And then like you said, looking at all the factors that affect the deal. And I think a lot of times people don't appreciate that. They tend to look at the things that they think are really good about the property, which in a lot of cases are probably true, but they don't look at the whole picture, of the context of those things relative to these other comps or other examples. And so I think getting into kind of more of what we're calling like marketing gimmicks or the ways that people get taken advantage of. If you think in terms of there's an emotional issue that every seller has, that I'm really trying to get the optimal outcome and I'm trying to avoid missing that. I'm trying to avoid what I see as a bad outcome, which is selling something for less than I could have sold it. And I think it's just human. I mean, even for me, like when I'm investing in the stock market, if I'm kind of trading something, a lot of times, like I don't want to miss the high water mark, even though it's pretty much impossible to always hit the high water mark. And when you look at really smart investors, they're not trying to hit the high water mark. They're trying to hit a sale that makes them money so that they can go do it again. But I think people just get greedy and they want that little bit extra so they can say, man, I didn't give anything up. I got the highest price I could. And so there's a lot of, what we call gimmicks or marketing ploys that are very effective, unfortunately, because what they're trying to do is solve that problem for the seller and say, hey, you're worried about this. We're going to make sure that you get the highest price for your property and you avoid this outcome that you're worried about. Unfortunately, these kind of ideas or ways to do it don't work. And we've seen this over and over again in our career where people, they do get taken advantage of. They actually get the suboptimal outcome that they were fearing the entire time.
Well, it's interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking a good way to frame this is deals that we went and sat down with a landowner, a company, a board, whatever it was. We pitched the business competitively against another broker. And we got the call back that, hey, we're going to go with the other broker. And this is why. And then they didn't sell it. And then we ended up selling it down the road. So there's a lot of those situations. So I'm thinking this would be over 10 years ago, but I remember we didn't get selected on a deal because, and this was back before we were DMRE, we were part of ARA. And ARA was large across the US, but they weren't as big as CBRE or JLL. They weren't global. They were national. And we didn't get selected because we didn't have, as many contacts in our database as I can't remember if it was who it was. It may have even been like HFF or somebody back then, but we didn't like have as many contacts on our database. So again, we didn't get selected for that. They didn't sell the property. And then, we got hired and we sold the property. Yeah. And the whole point was like, it doesn't matter how many contacts you have in your database. Like, what is that really? Yeah. But that was the whole pitch. I just remember back then, it was like every pitch we go to, it was all about like, we have 30,000, 500,000, we have 1 million, we have like 1 million contacts, and I'm sure you remember that. And then there was international. Like, well, we have like all these contacts in Asia and all these contacts in Europe, and we were doing deals with these international groups, but we also knew the way that they worked. And if that was if that was a gimmick, or if that was actually like, is the broker at this competitor really calling people in Asia?
Well, I think that what you're trying to do when you're using that gimmick with the seller is you're saying you need to fully expose the property because there's someone in Asia or someone in Europe or there's someone on this 1 million person database that no one else is going to get your property to them, but I'm going to get it in front of them. And then they're going to be the highest paying, buyer for your property. But unfortunately, the reality is, I would say at any one time, and this depends on the use type, but there's probably maybe 500 to 3,000, groups that you should never really need to get to more than that for your property. And a lot of times it's probably more like 50, depending on, again, what kind of property it is. If you're trying to really hit a high watermark, there's not that many buyers who are actually active in your market, in your MSA and kind of your region, that are capable of paying that kind of price and getting it capitalized. There's a lot of noise out there, but there's not a lot that are actually doing deals. And then also, an email blast. I mean, we all get hundreds of emails. If there's actually, first of all, there's not actually emails going to 1 million people, but let's just say that there's an email going to 10,000 or 15,000 people or 20,000 people. The majority of those emails are going to spam. People aren't really looking at them. They're going to the wrong person in the company. And so what always has worked over that strategy, which really is not a strategy, it sounds really good, but it's a complete failing strategy. We've seen this for 15 years now. Is actually having relationships with the better buyers and being able to get them on the phone and talk to them. Or if you shoot them an email, they actually look at the email from you because they know who you are, or they know your company and they know you're credible, and you tend to have good deals that you send out. And I'll talk to some of our our developer clients all the time who are like, hey, there are certain brokers, I just don't even like look at the emails they send me. Or if they call me, I don't return the call. And I'm not trying to be rude, but I don't have time to do that. And they've never sent me anything that's good before. And I just don't, I don't have any faith that it's worth my time to look at it. But we a lot of times are on, a texting relationship or a phone call relationship where we can get in front of them and at least present why we think the site's a good site and talk around the objections that they have. Because there's always objections, and that's fine. Every deal has the blind spots and the issues a seller may not see, as well as the good things. But having the rapport with these guys to be able to talk through it with them and help them understand it. And it's not real to think that all that can happen through an email blast. And do you want to hit the international thing? Because I think that's a good thing to talk about. Because again, that sounds really good. I'm not just going to go beyond, people nationally, but I'm going to, be showing your property to these buyers in China or Europe or wherever that, they're billionaires or something, and they're going to want to, go pay up for a deal in Texas.
Well, I think to explain that, it's important to realize like there's a way that the business is structured and done. And so equity groups, Carlyle, Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, like the majority of the money in the space to buy land, to build big projects. So if your goal is, I want to sell my property for the most money I can, the majority of that money is coming from institutions. Those institutions don't want to look at raw land sites. Like they're not set up to get emails directly, to get advertised directly. They want to work through quality developers. And so you'll see all the time, there'll be like a new developer that will put a property under contract. And then what they'll try to go do is go shop that to these institutions. And the feedback will be their sponsor, which would be the developer that's trying to get the money for the project. They can't get it because the institution's saying, I don't want to work with like a new developer, even if they have a project planned. And so that there's really like no chance that institution is just going to look at a land site directly. They're going to go through a developer. And in a very similar way, the international buyers, they aren't just like surfing the web and looking at emails of sites in Texas or New York or wherever and just making offers on land sites, they're calling whoever their representative is. So they'll have advisors. Like if we've done deals with groups in Asia, Germany, all over really, Middle East, everywhere. They have an advisor that they go through because they know like it would be so foolish of them to just be like, even if they have a lot of money, it's probably why they have a lot of money. They make smart decisions. They're not just like buying stuff everywhere just because they like it. And land's too complicated because they want to understand zoning. They want to understand local economics. They want to understand environmental, just all the things going on in the market. At the end of the day, they're savvy. Like if you're sitting in Dubai, you're probably not going to be very impressed by any land in the US because Dubai is like incredible, right? But you're going to be impressed in it if you think you can make a good return. And you're not going to go make that decision on your own. You're going to go through an advisor. And so it's on the international side, it's not peppering all those guys directly. It's knowing who are the developers that have the relationships that are doing the deals. Like right now, a lot of the money is coming out of Japan. And the Japanese are seeing a huge opportunity to invest in the United States, to invest in development. I would say most of what we're seeing in the DFW area is being funded by Japanese like firms. Some of these firms have been around like 400 or 500 years, longer than our country's been a country. They make slow decisions. They only work with like the cream of the crop, the Trammell Crows, the Hines, like the big name developers that have long-standing histories, or they only work with people they have direct relationships with over a long period of time. So like there are some groups that are smaller private developers, but they've been flying to Japan and meeting directly with those investors for over a decade just to get to the point of them doing like one deal with them. So again, you're a broker blasting a site to all these people in Japan. Like they're not going to just like respond to your email blast and make you an offer on your property. It's just not the way that it's set up and works. And so our job is really to go to the developers and go to the advisors that have those relationships.
That's right. Yeah. And I think, the true reality is that for the most part, if you have a high profile site, and even if your site's not a great site, typically the highest paying buyer is going to be an active group that's more local or regional to where your site is. I mean, sometimes we do see out-of-state developers coming in and overpaying for sites. That's happened historically at certain points in certain markets. And we're aware of that when that is happening. And those guys are still on our list because those are actual developers, say in Florida or, somewhere on the East Coast or somewhere on the West Coast. They're not always active. The transaction risk is typically much higher with those groups, but there are times where they're still the right choice to give them a shot. But for the most part, it's the groups that know Texas, that they understand, like you're saying, the nuances of environmental regulations here and zoning laws and, utility issues and detention, all these different things. Land is so much more complicated than if you're an investor who's getting sent like an investment sales deal and it's a building you can look at the cash flow and you can look at all this stuff. That's a lot easier to analyze than just getting some raw land, that you have a lot to check on with that to understand what you're really looking at. And so for the most part, I'd say 95% of the time, there are certain buyers that are really strong in certain markets, and understanding who those groups are and having a rapport with them is really important if you're a broker. Because if you can't get in front of them and convince them that they should look at the site, you're not going to be able to do a very good job for your seller because they have the whole market to look at. I mean, they have hundreds of sites, maybe thousands of sites to look at. They're going to maybe do 5 deals a year a lot of times. Maybe they do 10 if they're really active, but they're not going to do 50 deals a year. And so then they're going to be very picky about what they do. And so I think it's really important to make sure that a smaller list is getting hit, but instead of like these email blasts and these small touches, a very, well thought out kind of plan of attack of phone calls, face-to-face meetings, maybe there's some text involved or some emails involved, but like really engaging with that person and making sure they understand the opportunity. And also, I'm sure you agree with this, Tom, sometimes getting passes from those groups is very valuable information. Because if they've really looked at it and they've really analyzed it and they have a list of objections that are real, that's valuable if I'm a seller to know why they're saying that. If Trammell Crow is sitting down and saying, hey, there's these 5 things and we don't think we can capitalize this deal right now because of that, that's still valuable market information that can help you make decisions on your property.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's a lot of these land sites that a group like Trammell Crow will say, these are the issues. And then they'll go under a contract with someone else. They'll never close because of those issues. So instead of just ignoring that, you also want to think about opportunity cost and getting tied up. It's really easy in our business. I've been trying to think since you said the white knight buyer, because we've joked about that over the years. We'll get a listing and inevitably you get a call from somebody and it's like, it's always way too good to be true. And it's I don't think it's ever panned out. So we'll joke like, I think it's the white knight buyer. They're going to come in, they're going to close fast. They're going to pay the highest price. And it just never happens. And it's like time and time again. And I remember some sites we marketed in Houston in some really good locations, high-rise sites. And some of the people that call, it's like it's a doctor with some plan or something, and they're going to do some huge deal. And it just like, when it like came to signing, could never like sign the deal up, it was like, could never show up with the money, just not, it's just, you don't want to be, that goes back to, you're so worried about missing out on like the highest or something that could potentially be out there. You really have to decide like, what are you really trying to accomplish? And we always say we want to find the best buyer at the best price. We're not trying to find the buyer that can pay the highest price, because the buyer that can pay the highest price often doesn't actually close. They just put it on a piece of paper. That's very common in our business. It's hard for owners to understand that a huge part of our business is it's very low barriers to entry to start a development company. Now, it's very difficult to be successful, but it's very low barriers to entry to start one, because really what developers are in a lot of ways, it's just brokers. They're putting a property under contract. A lot of times they're literally like at risk to $100 of non-refundable earnest money. Sometimes they'll get 6 months of free time. There's a lot of developers that do nothing during that free time, and they're out just shopping. They put a nice, pretty package together of what it could be, and they're just trying to shop for money the whole time. And but they a lot of times will put the highest price on a piece of paper. And so that's where you have to be really careful. That I love what you said earlier. It's not about casting the net as wide as possible. Because really what is really difficult for brokers like us is when you cast the net really wide, and this has happened posting our properties a lot of times on these third-party platforms, it's where there's just anybody can see it and call. And some landowners want to do that, so we'll do it. And, it's fine, but what it happens a lot of times is we end up wasting a lot of time calling people back that don't have any money. That are just kind of calling like, what's going on with that property? What is that? And it's way more about the quality. So like you said, there may only be like 50 really qualified buyers for a site like this. I can go call 2,000, but it's really just going to be a waste of time on 95% of those.
I think it's a really good thing to help the audience understand what you're saying is that if you have a really expensive site that's really valuable, almost never is the highest paying group going to be the group that's a cash buyer. And I think people confuse that and think, well, the strongest groups are the cash buyers. They're going to pay most for my property. The reality is the cash buyers pay the lowest for your property. They're typically an investor or maybe a few developers that do that, but they normally want to get a break in the price for that. The highest paying group is someone who is the best at raising money to capitalize the development on your property. Because your property is only worth that much if I can build something on it that makes a lot more money to justify paying so much for your property. And so when you start looking at it that way, it's like, okay, they have to go raise money. Like you said, they're really like a broker. And so if all they are is some guy that doesn't have a great track record, he can put a big number on a piece of paper, but when he goes to try and raise the money, if he doesn't have the track record, no one's going to give him the money. He's going to drop the deal. But some of these developers who have a history of closing a lot of deals, having a lot of success with deals, they're actually talking to like Japanese equity firms and, all the different, whether it's Carlyle, whoever it is, they have that credibility in the market. They're going to pay the most for your property, not because they're using their own money. They may use some of their own money, but they're using someone else's money. But they're trusted to do that in a way that makes money for these, capital partners that are very diligent to try and not lose money. And so that hopefully helps people kind of understand why it's not such a wide field of buyers. Now, if you have some really small site, it's a neighborhood site or something, that could be different. But we're talking about these really good development, kind of sites that are going to be a different kind of buyer than just some random, couple acres somewhere on a street.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize like the cash buyer could be the best buyer, because what you need to sign up for or realize you're signing up for, if you go with the buyer that's the qualified developer that's the best at raising money, is depending on the market, it could be the strongest developer in Houston or Dallas, and it's going to take them 2 years to get that closed just because of the market. And so it's not that just because they are, but another developer wouldn't get it closed. They would also have it under contract for multiple years, but they wouldn't actually close it. And that's probably hard for if you're not used to being in this business. It's probably hard to be like, how does somebody put a property under contract for like 2 years and not close it? But that happens. And then, how does like a Trammell Crow, who's an incredible buyer, how do they put a property under contract for like a year and they can't get it capitalized, but then they get it capitalized 6 months later? It's like hard to understand that. And so it depends on your situation. It might be better to take the cash buyer if you're more focused on, I want to get this sold at a good number. So you're not like fire selling it, but it could be that you have a unique cash buyer. Because like you said, there's only a couple of them, but there's these buyers that aren't really investors. They also can develop and they have cash and they're willing to maybe they like the property enough to step up on it. What I'm saying with this is just don't be the person that you're waiting for the best thing. You're waiting for kind of that unicorn buyer and you actually miss that because those cash buyers also go away. They'll be interested at a point in time in your property and then they'll go deploy the capital somewhere else. And it could be that, no, I want to go like the route of the developer that has to go raise money. That can be a really good decision. But I think we're just having to tell people in the type of market that we've been in the last couple of years, it's, you want it to close in 6 months, but don't not do the deal because it's going to take 9 months or 12 months. Like it's just taking longer. And once you commit to the right developer, you're probably going to be committing to give them more time ultimately, just in the kind of market that we're in. We're not seeing, I don't know what you guys are seeing in Houston, but we're not seeing a lot of deals close early or close on time. It's happening in some cases, but a lot of deals, it's just taking a little bit longer to get them done.
Well, a lot of it depends on the actual site, and a broker understanding how does this site line up with where the market is today. So, there was a point in time where these more commodity sites were still selling really easily because people are doing this attainable product for multifamily and they could capitalize those deals. That's fallen out of favor in the last 6 to 9 months, and now those are hard to capitalize. And so I think to your point, Tom, there's some sites that we know that even really good developers will probably have a hard time capitalizing today. And if there is a cash buyer who can close faster, even at a little bit of a discount to the guy who's going to tie it up for 18 months, if you're a seller that wants it closed, that's a good deal for you. Mm-hmm. Now, there's also some sites where they're just really good sites. And even in a more difficult market, they're real deals. They can get capitalized. And we're seeing some stuff in Houston where overall it's a more challenging market, but there's still some really high prices being paid for certain specific sites. They're just like the high barriers to entry, really good demographics, good submarket rents. Developers will come out of their shoes for those, and especially the stronger developers. And they're not closing them super quick, but they can close them within maybe 9 months, which is pretty quick right now for a deal, and they can actually get them capitalized. And so I think understanding, having a broker understands in a real way, like what kind of a property do we have here? Like where does it line up for the current market and what options does that give us? And I think a really important, point to bring up here is another kind of newer marketing gimmick that I think is very well-meaning, but I think can be misleading is we're seeing more and more brokers try and model these sites. A lot of times they're using an investment sales model, or maybe they have an investment sales, brokers in their office. And so they're trying to take a model and apply it to a site. And it seems to make a lot of sense because I think what you're trying to tell the seller is we can find the accurate price where your property will really trade right now. We can, mathematically show you that. And so we know that's where it's actually going to trade. Why do you think maybe that's, sounds great, but maybe not as effective in the real world?
Well, I mean, the reason it's not effective for one thing is when we market these properties and we'll talk to a lot of different developers. And even if you narrowed it down to a very specific project, like, 5 acres on the freeway for a wrap project, if you go talk to 10 developers, you're going to get 10 different models. There's 10 different costs of capital. There's 10 different ways to look at rents. There's 10 different assumptions on construction pricing. So, and then there's also the element of what return on costs you underwriting to, how aggressive are you going to be? How aggressive is your firm going to be? And so it's great that you're trying to model it, but we've never felt like that model is as accurate as the understanding that we have of the market, of competitive analysis of what else is going on, other offers that we're currently making in the market. trying to create a model that blends everything, I'm just not going to be accurate. I mean, there's so many sites that a developer will tell us, I'm putting in my model at 0. So I just wonder with these brokers, do they ever go tell the landowner after they model it that it's 0? They never do. They're going to go change and slide everything up and down until they kind of get it to where they think that's what it's worth. But I had a broker ask me, he's like, we don't have comps, because they don't have comps, and that's one of the great things for us is we've been so active. We have so many comps. And then we make thousands of offers on the buy side. So we have all this data we can look at. But if you don't have comps, kind of all they can do, it's the other way to say it is if you're the landowner, you're like, well, how did you get to the value? And so that's why you say, well, we modeled it. But really all the model is the value that you wanted to get to. You just made the model say that value because there's way too many assumptions. There's no one way to do the model. And so that's where it doesn't, a lot of those sites that those brokers are modeling and then they're getting the listings, they're not selling right now. So the question would be like, why? If you modeled it, like what was the model based off of?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we've seen, I think what you're alluding to is over and over again, we'll market these properties where you get 10 or 15 or 20 offers. And we know a lot of these groups really well and have, good relationships with the developers. And, you'll have a site that maybe we sell for 120 a foot, but we're getting offers, there's some guys coming in at 75 or 85 or 90 a foot. And they're saying, hey, I'm like just putting everything in the model I can. I'm getting as aggressive as I can. I can't get above 90 a foot. I don't know how these other guys are getting to 120. And that's because, like you're saying, there's actually different math for different developers. If you have your own GC and you're doing a lot of volume, your exit assumptions, your return on costs you're trying to hit, there's just all these different factors that start to play into that model. And so everybody's model is a little bit different. And you can't just take a model from one group and transfer it to another group and say, well, they should be able to do that model. Because for them, it probably doesn't work because they have different factors that affect their deals, maybe different goals that affect their deals. And then even beyond that, there are certain sites that would fit a model and certain ones that don't. Like we were just saying, there are certain sites that in today's market, I can model it. Like I have sites that, we were talking kind of joking about sites that we personally own. We can throw a model on that's a real model. It doesn't mean I can sell for that price. I wish that was all I had to do. But it's a model that actually matches where the market is today and what equity wants today, which is a much more challenging. I think if you're in a very frothy market, that probably works a little bit easier because you get a lot of money out there looking for deals. You get people that are getting funded. So we talk about these developers where you have some of the weaker developers that don't have their own capital, that don't do a lot of deals, that tie stuff up. In a frothy market, those guys actually get to do deals, which is pretty scary. So they will float out, these models on sites where it should not work, like doing a wrap deal in a suburban market that's not a wrap market, for example. But they have a model that makes sense, and then the deal just gets destroyed if it actually gets built because it's in a frothy market. But I think that hopefully helps the audience understand why this doesn't really work. But I can understand as a seller why this would make a lot of sense because it sounds very sophisticated. It sounds like, wow, you're taking an actual model and you have all these factors you're looking at, and it sounds like that should really help me sell my property.
Yeah. I was going to ask you back to the international buyer or even just the out-of-state buyer. Why does a landowner, because this is so common, why do they think that if I'm talking to someone in New York, if I'm talking to someone in California, if I'm talking to someone in Asia, they can pay more?
I think it's just this idea that maybe they hear about, whether it's in the news or the Wall Street Journal or, just people talking about, maybe there's some story about an international buyer, coming in and paying a lot, which a lot of times may not even be true. Another thing people hear a lot about is California buyers coming in overpaying, which could even be more on the residential side than the commercial side. But I think even more than that, there's this fear of if I don't fully expose the property, if everyone doesn't see it, somehow I'm missing the person that's going to really pay up for it. And I think another one that people talk about is corporations. Like maybe there's some corporation out there that just really wants my site and they'll just overpay for it. And it's maybe a once in a 50-year kind of deal, but they're out there. And if they were to see it, that they would pay up for it. And so I think it's more it comes from an anxiety that people are, the marketing gimmick is playing off the anxiety the person has of missing the market and selling a little bit too cheap. And, it's just, unfortunately, it's just not reality, and unfortunately, the further you expose it sometimes out away from the real players in the market, the less people even know what you're talking about and the less they pay attention to what you're talking about. And so it can lead to a lot of wasted effort.
Yeah. The reason I asked the question is it's not logical to me that just because somebody doesn't live here, they would pay more money. I don't really understand especially when you're talking about sophisticated people like corporations, and developers. My experience has been Tim, there's been so many developers from California that want to do stuff in Texas. So for the last, however many years being up here in Dallas, 5 years now in Dallas, I've talked to so many California developers and a lot of them have never done anything still.
Yeah.
Like I've been talking to them for years and they want to look at the sites, but they don't really understand it, to your point. And a lot of them, when I've seen them be successful, and we talked about this on another podcast, it's when they hired somebody to be local. Until they hired like a local development guy, they really didn't do anything because you can make so many mistakes. And like I talked to a group out of New York yesterday and, we were talking about different properties in Dallas. They really want to be in Dallas. And, they were like, is anything selling down there? Nothing makes sense. Back to the model component. And these guys are in New York, right? So this is like the landowner's dream. I got the call from the guys in New York. They're doing all these deals. Dallas is the growth market. I bet they're going to pay way more than everybody else. He was quoting me prices below anything I've seen trade ever here. So low for multifamily land. They're a multifamily group. So low. And it would be like a bottom feeder. And it's fine. Like that's their model, right? So, and they've been able to do it other places. But just because you're in New York, I don't know how that has anything to do with the fact that you're going to pay more money for a property in Texas. And so that's, I think, what it's frustrating, I think, for you and me when we have to spend so much time with our clients, like almost like arguing about this. It's like there's a group like, Trammell Crow or Alliance or Hines or, Stone Lake or whoever it is. There's all these like really strong, reputable developers that have like local presence. They work with all the big institutions. Some of them have like billions of dollars of funds. And the landowner's like, I really just want to get it in front of the guys from, China. And it's like, why? Like, it's not logical.
Well, I think maybe part of it is that there's a belief that if they're not sophisticated either about my market, they'll overpay.
Yeah.
They don't really know what they're doing. And I'm a little too worried that the local guys know too much of what they're doing, and so they're going to maybe give me a more of an accurate price for my property. And it's almost a little bit of like, I want to take advantage of someone from out of my market because they don't really know what they're doing. And they just stumble into my property and kind of buy it off hype, and that, like you made a good point. We're not talking about selling a house or selling, a small investment. A lot of times we're talking about selling a very expensive property. People that have that kind of sophistication, especially because we're not normally talking about just the land price, but a development that goes on the land that could be anywhere from 80 to 100 or $200 million. Those are smart people. They're smart corporations. They don't just go into a market and not know what they're doing and just start, overpaying for everything. And a lot of times, like you're saying, they're actually more cautious and they're cognizant that they could really make mistakes because they don't know it. And so they take their time and then they try and find local people that they can trust to work with to make those decisions. But I think that's maybe where it comes from, is you're kind of hoping that this out-of-town guy just is missing a lot of stuff and just overlooks things and is willing to buy your property anyway at a higher price.
Yeah. And it's just, there's been very, very few situations where we've seen it. The few that I can think of, because there was a couple that we did over 10 years ago in Midtown in Houston, where it was an international developer, but they were working through an advisor. It wasn't like it was direct to them. We met with them, but they were working through an advisor. He was in the market. He was there to help them get a beachhead in Houston and go do some projects. And they did hone in on an area after a ton of evaluation. It wasn't quick, and they studied the entire market. They didn't just jump on an opportunity, I guess is what I'm trying to say. They studied the entire market and then they actually went and bought some properties off market. It also wasn't even something that was marketed. They went and they bought it off market. And then there was a group more recently that was based in kind of the Southeast area, but they were backed by a group in South America. And they came into the market and did a lot of deals. But again, they worked through a developer that was based in the Southeast. They weren't doing it directly. And so they ended up being a good buyer, but it was similar. They studied the market They evaluated opportunities on and off market. Like it was a real strategy. They had a product they were going to build. They weren't looking at it like the land as much as they were looking at what they were going to build on the land. And so I just think that that's a huge piece to we're just going to kind of blast the site out and someone's going to call and just buy the site. It just doesn't normally happen.
What do you think about all these online listing platforms like LoopNet or Crexi or CoStar? And I know they've been around for a pretty long time now. It definitely feels like when you look into the future, especially with AI advancements and the technology we're talking about, that they're for sure that they're here to stay. They'll probably get better over time with what they're able to do. But what's your experience with those in Dallas as far as using those platforms to try and sell land?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't seen a lot of success in it just because earlier I was referring to third-party platforms. I was thinking of really a lot of those where a lot of times just you get a lot of calls. It's mostly calls from brokers a lot of times, and even a lot of calls from like residential brokers, which is fine. But it's the reality is the properties we're marketing they're not going to sell to somebody that's probably represented by a residential broker. If we were selling different properties, then it might be more valuable. And I think those online platforms are pretty incredible for residential because I think things are so much more dialed in. I mean, the way that you can dial in like an estimated value of a home, just that as an example, it's so much more dialed in than land. And so, when we get the reps for all those third parties that just hound us constantly that they're the greatest thing and they're selling all these properties and stuff, but we just have never been able to attribute sales. We've posted on those platforms. You'll get, we had this many thousands and thousands of views, and it's like, we're not getting the offers because of that. That's, we're getting the offers because we're going and we're talking to the real developers in the market or the real buyers in the market. And a lot of times, unfortunately, the calls that come from those posts or the emails that come through, it's more just a lot of work to keep up with them. And they end up just being people that are kind of like interested. Like, well, I live in the area. I wanted to know like what this was, like there are the people that are like, I'm really interested in real estate, and so I'm just kind of tracking, like, what are you asking? So unfortunately for us, we have limited time, like for me or you to be on the phone. Or if our clients want us selling their property, we need to try to, every time we're talking to somebody, it's a qualified buyer. There's not really a way that buyers are qualified on a lot of those platforms. And so that can be a challenge because if you're not qualified, and you're just able to just call, we don't know when they leave us a voicemail who it is. So we have to call them back. And then a lot of times, like, nothing against the person, but they're just not the buyer for the property. And so it just becomes an opportunity cost for us.
Yeah. And I think it might also be helpful for the audience to understand like the way that the top tier buyers work, because I think that what you're thinking when you're thinking about my property needs to be on LoopNet or Crexi or CoStar, one of these different sites, is that one of these developers who's a really high paying buyer, or maybe you're thinking their equity or, whoever this group is, they're the buyer I want to target, that they're surfing on there and they're doing searches and they're looking at properties. But the reality is, these are very busy people and they're typically building deals. They have deals in our contract they're working through. And then they're also seeing a ton of deals that are brought to them from brokers in the market, on market and off market deals. I mean, people are trying to get to them every single way they can. So in our experience, they're never surfing on LoopNet or Crexi or one of these websites looking at deals. But the groups that are typically brokers that are trying to find sites, or they're investors, and they're typically the bottom tier investors. So like our experience in Houston, now we've been using these sites for maybe 8 years off and on, and we typically do it just to help out a client because we'll get clients to say, I want to have it on there because I know it may not be that great, but I just don't want to miss anything. And we're like, that's fine. I don't want you to be worried that the market's not seeing it. So we'll put it on there. And we've never done one deal in Houston that's come from one of those buyers. And they've always been super lowball, people that are just trying to steal the property. They're just on there surfing those sites, looking for opportunities. But it's never been one of the quality buyers that's found it that way. And again, going back to what do you actually need to do is make sure that you're getting in front of those groups, not making them go find it. Make sure that you're getting the property in front of them in a way that they can understand and have it explained to them and look at the whole picture, the good things about the property, the challenges with the property. We a lot of times will lead with some of the challenges. Hey, there's an environmental problem we know about, but here's how that can be resolved, or there's this detention issue that's going to be a little bit more detention for the site. There's creative ways to solve these things, and you don't really do any benefit to anyone by hiding them and letting them come out later. And so when you can go in and have a really educated conversation with the developer where they respect the way it's being presented to them and they get interested, that's how you really get a transaction done, not just posting it on one of these sites. And I am interested to see as we look into the future, I think land is going to be the hardest one, for when you start talking about these platforms and AI and, really being able to present those in a way the market, can absorb and can look at in a valuable way. I don't think we're anywhere close to that yet, but I'm interested to see how that develops, if at some point it becomes more disruptive, but so far it hasn't been.
Well, I think, as we kind of start to wrap up, I think that the reality of what you're saying is that there's not a shortcut at the end of the day to an easy way to sell a property. Like, it's going to take work, and it's a lot of times it takes a lot of groundwork. Like I was telling you about a property we recently sold in Dallas where we got it from a client that we're listing another property for him. He had been listing it with another broker for, I think he said maybe 5 years, and had never received like any offers, didn't really know if they were even like email blasting it or anything. And so we were kind of like, this is going to be interesting. Like, if they've been marketing it for 5 years, like what's going to be the situation here? And so we spent a lot of time having qualified buyers in our system that we can send an email to and then we can follow up and talk to. Well, we sent out one email on this site and found a buyer, and it's already closed, 90 days later. And I think that it was just like, wow, okay, so the other broker probably wasn't doing anything on it. Like, it was probably on one of the third-party platforms. And I don't know if they were responding to those calls or not. Like, I don't know what was going on, but I was really surprised that, 5 years of working it and we got it sold in just a couple months, like start to finish. And it just goes back to, we've spent so much time with our contact management, making sure we have the right contacts at different companies, making sure that we know them. You mentioned the other day, being able to just text, like personally text a guy and say, hey, are you looking at this site that we have out? And he texts you right back and says, it's not going to work for us, or yeah, I'm interested and I'm digging in. Like, that's so valuable. It's so much more valuable than just going really broad on a third-party platform. Going to the actual buyer, that's way more likely, especially within a condensed period of time, because people that are not familiar, the whole education process is going to take so long for them to do anything.
Yeah, I think I'll end up by saying, whatever you do, don't make your decision based on who brings donuts to the meeting.
Yeah, we've seen that before. Yeah.
We had a deal, this is going back a little bit, but a deal in Houston. It was a condo association. They had a really good infill site. It was actually a night meeting. I think we were meeting like at 6 or 7 o'clock at night. I remember it was dark during the meeting. And we actually, I think, pitched first. And then this other broker came in second with all these donuts. And they ended up picking the other broker, I'm assuming because of the donuts. And that broker sold the property for way under market. I mean, way under anything we saw trade before or after that deal sold. And so, I mean, it just goes back to, just make sure that you're really making the decision based on, actual experience, actual market reach, not just some of these surface level things. The person's super nice, or there's a common relationship, or they bring donuts, whatever it might be, but don't have the capabilities to really maximize the price of the property.
Well, Tim, thanks for the good conversation today.
Yeah, that was good.
Looking forward to the next one of these. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
All right, well, definitely reach out to us, to Tim or I. Follow us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. If you have questions about land you own in Texas, send us an email at texaslandguys@dmre.com and follow us on LinkedIn to stay updated.